It is Monday, March 19th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm sitting here today with Mr. Matt Towery. Mr. Towery is currently chairman of the Government Affairs and Public Policy Practice here at Hall Booth Smith. We're filming at their offices in Atlanta. Mr. Towery is a prolific author and columnist, as well as a noted pollster and political analyst. He was the co-founder and chairman of Insider Advantage and Internet News. Mr. Towery served several terms in the Georgia House of Representatives, representing a district in suburban Cobb County, and he was the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor in 1990. He attended the University of Georgia and is a graduate of Cambridge University and Stetson University Law School. Thank you very much, Mr. Towery, for joining us today.
Sure.
Really do appreciate you taking out some time on a dreary Monday morning here in downtown Atlanta.
What else would it be?
Very fair, very fair. So tell me about your childhood and upbringing. You're a Atlanta, Cobb County native. Which one do you identify as?
I think Atlanta, given the fact, my family's been here, since, I don't know, early 1800s, whatever. And they were scattered about Georgia, some in North Georgia, some in the Atlanta area. So we've been around a long time, but we've never had. Vinings was sort of the nexus because my great-grandfather owned a farm in Vinings, which is now where 285 crosses near Oakdale. And I believe that was my great-great-grandfather, maybe. It was my great-great-grandfather. And then my great-grandfather grew up on that farm. And my family ultimately all sort of began to center on Vinings as our home. So
I was listening back to your interview with Bob Short, and you mentioned the MA First company, which became Scripto.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're a Republican now, but that was the company identified with Robert First, who was a Republican.
Right.
Jimmy Carmichael, who was a Georgia Democrat,
right.
became a Republican later on.
Right.
Was that company? Was that just a brief occupation, or was that company sort of prominent in your family's?
Only in the sense of my uncle on my father's side ended up being the CEO of the company when it was sold to Wilkinson Sword. So of course I knew Gene First and Bob and all those folks, but it didn't play a prominent role.
So did you grow up in a political family, or was your family more in tune with sort of business and just going about their daily lives?
Not a political family. My family were all about business. Everyone was in the ad business or the printing business, forever, going back to the pre-1900 time period. And so we were very much business oriented. I think I got the political bug when I watched the assassination coverage of President Kennedy. I was barely able to remember it, but I know that it had a huge impact on me, and I think that's when I became more interested in politics and news.
So walk me briefly through how you became Governor Lester Maddox's sort of de facto body man page.
Well, when you're 10 years old, you're not a body man this year. We had to write a business letter in fourth grade, third grade, I think. Everybody has to do it. And Lester had one of his many times he was in the hospital. He constantly was having nosebleeds and that wouldn't stop, or gallstones or whatever. So it wasn't the healthiest thing, but he was in the hospital, and so I thought, well, I'll write the governor. And Georgia was so small back then that about a week and a half later, we had a phone call at the house, and we're eating dinner, and my dad answered the phone, and this man said, is Matt Towery there? And my dad said, who's calling? I said, Lester Maddox. My dad looked at me, he said, Matt, Lester Maddox is on the phone for you. And my dad actually had done some of the ad work for the Callaway campaign. So
Sure.
He was as shocked as anybody. And it took from there. He asked me to come down to the Capitol, and he sort of took a liking to me. I was pretty precocious and would say whatever Lester liked to hear, I guess, about how great he was. But he was a good man. He was not, the Lester Maddox I knew was a very caring person. No, I don't think truly, I don't think he was racist in the sense that we see where you hate a race or something like that. I tried to get Lester to change in the later years of his life. I actually gave him an opportunity with my national column to say he was sorry, and he did. And then after that, his ultra-conservative friends just beat him to a pulp, and he called me and he said that I had misled him. And he forgave me for it in the end, but I told Lester, I said, I recorded it. I said, so not to sneak up on you, but this is what you said. And it was disconcerting because I would have liked to that had been his George Wallace moment, but it never really came.
I don't want to ask you to be some sort of a shade tree psychologist or psychiatrist or anything. His policy, the Pickrick episode, National Magazine. You said you don't believe that he was a racist, but obviously that's how he was interpreted by people here in Georgia, nationally. What do you think was the disconnect?
Well, let me back up. I'm not sure that anyone in the South in the early 60s wasn't a racist in some sense or another, because race, as it continues to be, it just haunts particularly Atlanta and Georgia. Race was a constant issue, but we had different standards back then, and I never heard him say the N word or any. I was around him a lot, and I saw a lot of. He tended to be more appreciative and kind to people who were poor. It didn't matter if they were black or white than anyone else.
Which was his background. His growing up as a poor
grievously
white.
Poor, yeah. And I think that the Pickrick thing, it could be analyzed forever and ever, but my take on it was that because Lester was loud, boisterous, loved attention, and had gotten in the middle of all this stuff, he was the perfect target. Going to Rich's, you're fighting Dick Rich and the Atlanta establishment. You go to Lester's, there's nobody there but Lester. And so that's how that happened. I'm not defending it, but and we all mature, and I think Lester matured as well. I mean, he was an uneducated man. He used to tell me that all the time, encouraging me to make sure I studied hard because he said he didn't get that opportunity. So he was uneducated, but smart and very charismatic. And I think in the end had a good heart.
You mentioned the Atlanta establishment. You grew up here.
Yeah.
Your father, your family was in advertising. This was the 60s was the heyday of Atlanta Magazine, the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
Tell me about the how important or central to sort of this establishment, this business establishment, political establishment, the notion of that was in driving Atlanta growth.
It was very small. Everyone knew everyone, just one person removed. So it's hard to explain now, but my dad ended up creating the largest sheet fed printing company in the Southeast, which I took over. But he also owned ad agencies, creative design agencies, and then he quietly owned ad agencies. But he would be the backer, but he would not publicly say he owned them because then all the ad agencies would have not given printing to the company. And my grandmother was the head of print advertising for Coca-Cola across, I think, worldwide in the end. She was the vice president with McCann Erickson, one of the very first women to really move to the top.
And what was her name?
Jeanette Towery. And she was a brilliant woman, very much like something out of a movie. And so, we were involved in a lot of different things in various aspects of the family. But, back then you didn't take it all that seriously because we were a very small city. I mean, I think maybe when I was 5 or 6 years old, we probably had 10 restaurants, excluding private clubs, that had tablecloths. And I tell this to people and they just can't believe it.
Mary Mac's about the...
I don't know. Nobody went to Mary Mac's from where I knew. I mean, that was more if you were over on that side, the cab area, Decatur, or whatever. No, it's called Heron's.
Right, you're on the west side, yeah.
Well, Heron's, downtown, really. You had Heron's, you had the Chateau Fleur de Lis, you had the Diplomat. These are restaurants where people like Ted Turner and everybody would eat. And but we didn't have many. We had one French restaurant called Emile's, and that was it.
Do you think because of the size in sheer numbers of individuals in the establishment that you could have outsized person. This wasn't New York City. This wasn't Washington, D.C.
Right.
It was a small place where people like Bob Woodruff
Yeah.
and Jasper Dorsey could really
Right.
wield some influence.
Right. Yeah, I mean, because everything was either Coca-Cola or it was the phone company or it was George Power or it was whatever. So yeah, they did. Dick Rich, I mentioned earlier with Rich's, was extraordinarily important because that bridged the gap in the Jewish community, which we've always had a very strong Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had Bob Woodruff, who clearly was the lead mule. You had Millsby Lane, who had come from Savannah, but
Citizens of Southern.
Yes, and he was a true driving force. Probably, I would say, one of the leading driving forces in the early '60s in a lot of the institutions, the Commerce Club, for example, and the like, created by him.
Since we're at 191.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned Mills Lane. We're at Hall Booth Smith.
Yeah.
The law firms back then. There's been a proliferation of law firms.
They're not even comparable. I mean, you had King and Spalding. You had Bobby Jones' firm, which was Jones Bird or something like that. You had
Brennan Asbill.
Yes, but they all have gone through so many permutations. I can't remember them all.
Right,
yeah,
sure.
All the firms were relatively small, and they were cottage law firms, and then we didn't have the mega firms. The person who really, well, I wouldn't say there are certain groups that created the mega firms in the large firms, and I mean Hall Booth we have over 150 lawyers plus now because we're adding them every day, and we're still a medium-sized firm. Mm-hmm. I think we're like number 15 in terms of size of law firms. So in Georgia, right.
And right across the street is Denton's, which is
the
mega firm,
and which I was very proud of, and still consider that to be a close relationship.
How would you describe the politics of Atlanta, of the Atlanta establishment back in the 60s and 70s when you were growing up and becoming active?
Well, I didn't know it as well. I mean, I probably saw more than I thought. The Georgia legislature was still extremely rural and extremely old-fashioned. The city was more progressive, with Ivan Allen as the leader, and Sam Massell, who was sort of he called himself the vice mayor. He created that position, basically, but Sam was sort of the up-and-coming new blood. They didn't necessarily get along, but which I don't think everybody knows. But
the '69 mayor's race,
exactly,
sort of the end of that relationship.
Exactly, and even before that, they were different styles and came from different groups. But I think in the '60s, it wasn't the political establishment though that grew Atlanta. I think it was the business establishment. The Atlanta Chamber of Commerce was extraordinarily significant back then. That's now, I guess, the Metro Chamber. But it was they owned it, I think, for a time period, Atlanta Magazine. They had a strong relationship with it.
1961 to
at least the early 70s.
At least probably. The 70s.
Yeah, and so there was a lot going on in promoting Atlanta, including television commercials and the like, and ads that would run in other cities or airlines. You get a magazine on airline that talked about Atlanta. So that it was a combination of the business community along with these business leaders, but everybody pitched in. Thinking John Portman, for example, and Tom Cousins both became extraordinarily important in the 1970s, in late 60s and 70s, in catapulting Atlanta to a new level. And of course, then you have my friend Andy Young, and a whole new generation, and then Billy Payne with his crazy idea that ended up working to create an Olympics here and all that, which really changed the city. The city, when I was born, had about 1 million people. When we held the Olympics in '96, I'm guessing our population was right at or under 3 million. And our population now for the SMA is right at 6.5 or 6. So We basically doubled our population since the Olympics.
With no end in sight.
No end. That's why I don't live here anymore. That's why I live in Florida.
Which was the, think back to the 1970s, 1980s, that was the explosive population center. Of course, its population is still growing as well.
Yeah, it is.
So your time in the legislature, as a page.
Right.
Tell me about those experiences. What it was like.
It was, like I said, very rural, very. Everybody was very polite, and I sort of got lucky, and I got the run of the place, so I could go to Lester's office, and then when he became the lieutenant governor, back then the tradition in the governor's office was that the staff would remain. In other words, all the secretaries, they called them secretaries then, all the assistants, all the designated person from the state patrol, they would all stay with the next governor. So when Jimmy Carter was elected, Lester and Jimmy didn't get along, but I didn't really understand that to the extent that I should have, and I didn't really care. So I would pop down from Lester's office, which at that time was up on the 4th floor, all the way down to the governor's office. Barry Beasley would say, well, the governor's not here. You can go in his office. You won't tell me. I'm 11, 12. Then Jimmy would come in, and sometimes I'd be ushered out. Sometimes I'd be standing there. I'm sure he wondered what this kid's doing there, which is what in the end ended up being a wonderful thing because as much as I was a Republican, I'm a huge admirer of Jimmy Carter, and I've argued over and over and over again that his presidency was much more effective than people realize. And when I say it, people are shocked, but I can give you the reasons why. And I like Jimmy. Carter was odd. If he got mad, what people don't know is if he got mad, he got really mad. He'd get really tough. He didn't always smile, but he was a good man, and he was a smart guy, and you could tell he was going places. And so it was great. I got to know Ham Jordan and Jody.
The Georgia Mafia.
Yeah, and I mean, in the end, these were the people I'd known all my life. In fact, I think there's a picture up there of me and Jimmy Carter and Ham right up on this wall. And so it was always, I always felt good that I had that background because although I could be extremely partisan, the partisanship in me really, I never really enjoyed that much because I felt like too many people were too good on other sides. Yeah.
Describe Jimmy Carter's managerial style, what you saw.
Well, I was too young to really see a lot. I mean, the only thing I could say is that he was not a politician in the Lester Maddox sense. He was not good at sort of making the legislators feel warm and fuzzy. And as a result, they revolted against his reorganization plan, which ultimately did pass, but they hated it. And,
because of Republicans.
Yes, because of Republicans. They also hated it because the most powerful person in the legislature in the Capitol at that time was Lester in a sense because he loomed as a former governor, but Ben Fortson, who was Secretary of State, was considered to be the power. Now, he really wasn't, but everyone thought he was.
Well, he'd been around since the 40s.
Yes, exactly. And so Ben, I never will forget, I was there one day, and Mr. Ben, as they said, was going to come down and give a speech against the reorganization plan on the floor, invited by Lester on the floor of the Senate. Now, they locked the doors. It was the biggest thing in the world. I didn't understand what was going on. But there were always feuding, but that I learned, of course, that it was very helpful as I was a legislator and then later looking at politics, that's just the nature of legislative bodies. The Senate fights with the House fights with the Senate, they all fight with the governor, and then they all go home.
Well, and this was the period, 1973, 74, when George L. Smith passed away. Mm-hmm. Tom Murphy becomes Speaker of the House. Right. So you got to see Tom Murphy as a youngster, and then as a colleague of his in the House of Representatives.
I did not know Tom Murphy well. I ended up knowing Tom Murphy to the point that I was with him when he had his stroke. So we came a long way. In fact, he was very hurt when I ran for lieutenant governor, and I campaigned against the good old boys, and I sort of used Tom as an example. And as I look back on it, I wish I hadn't, because I didn't know him as an adult. To me, he was one of the greatest leaders I've ever dealt with. He was brilliant, and he was actually very fair to the Republicans. The Republicans didn't realize it, but he would let us bring bills to that floor. I had a legislation that he was against. He spoke against it. I spoke for it, let us vote on it. he was and he was a great deal of fun behind the scenes. I mean, just had a great sense of humor, and was a very humble man in a lot of ways.
We can talk a little bit more as his style as speaker when you were an adult.
Yeah, sure.
But like many Two-Party Georgia alumni, you attended the University of Georgia, but you took sort of a circuitous route to Athens compared to some of the others.
Yeah, I started out. I was supposed to go to Georgetown University, and I got up there, and the debate coach, which is part of the reason why I was there, took a sabbatical, and I just thought, well, I don't want to be here. So.
My wife can commiserate, the former basketball player.
Yeah, I mean, well, Georgetown's a great school.
Sure.
And my heart was set on it. I mean, I turned down other schools, much bigger schools, to go to Georgetown, and then I ended up. Jasper Dorsey actually was the person who cleared the way for me to get into Georgia, because I was running a little bit late there, and so those were good times. So I was glad I was at Georgia. So many of the friends I know now are people that I knew as a freshman and sophomore. I mean, I could name zillions. And there, Ralph Reed was there with me. Keith Mason was there with me. You name it. So, it served me well, and I'm a complete devotee of the University of Georgia.
We always like to hear that. And we always like to get it recorded on camera.
Go Dogs! I love the place. Yeah.
Did you get active in politics while you were on campus? Did that sort of childhood interest?
Not at first. I mean, I got involved. I was on the freshman council with Tim Eccles, and I think Keith was on it too. And so we were on that. I did, I was just having a good time, to be honest with you. I was not. I was more a Democrat still. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until Mac Mattingly came along that I switched over to the Republican Party and became a Republican.
So, setting aside the fact that you were there when Herschel Walker was there, that's a different conversation. So, how did you get? I spoke with Ralph Reed, and Ralph Reed started with Herman Talmadge's campaign.
Right. So did I.
Oh, tell me about that. Tell me about that experience.
Well, John Thomas is a great guy. Was along with I'm trying to think of the other folks who were involved, because really, I guess the most important one would have been Rogers Wade.
Right.
He was a great guy. Is a great guy. Both of those guys are fantastic. And so all of us who were active in politics, we thought, well, we had to help Herman Talmadge. And my switch was not a dislike of Herman Talmadge. It was more like, well, they don't really need me. And so I had been given this opportunity to be forced on Mac Mattingly as a speechwriter, which he really didn't want. And but yet he's now probably, I count him as one of my 5 dearest friends who I talk to all the time. And he wasn't a great speaker at that time. He didn't have his message down totally. We were a ragtag campaign. I mean, truly, we had nobody. We had maybe 5 people in the campaign. But that was just a great experience. And Newt really is the reason that I ended up working with Mac, is because Newt said, hey, you got somebody who won the National Debate Championship. Why don't you get him to help you? And Mattingly agreed very reluctantly.
Now, he was over at West Georgia in Carrollton at this time. How did
I know Newt?
Yeah.
Okay. I taught one of Newt's daughters at a debate workshop to make extra money after I graduated from.
Talk about serendipity.
Yeah. And I hadn't even graduated yet. I graduated from high school at Pace, and I'd gone on to work in the summer. So I would work at these debate workshops. Okay. And you got paid great money. You had a great time. So I think I met. It was Kathy Gingrich, I think. Maybe it was Jackie. No, it was Kathy, I think. And but Newt and I sort of bonded when we were together working. He was going to review Mac's presentation in speeches, and he set up a television camera, and he was just berating Mac. He had a couple of consultants there too, and Mac wanted out of there, so he begrudgingly said he'd used me as a speechwriter, which he had no intent of really doing, to get out of the room. But in the end, I did write the stuff that Mac said, because we were we realized we were suddenly about to win, and we had to really start.
When did that dawn on
2
on
weeks
the
before the
campaign?
election, we realized that we were on the rise. Probably, I think we had a poll come out maybe a week before, maybe a week and a half before, because early voting and count and all that stuff back then. It was all election day, except for absentees. So, our pollster, who was Bob Teeter, has passed away now. But Bob, who was a great pollster, he showed that we were neck and neck, and we were going straight up, and Talmadge was coming down. And so I remember going in a room with Mac, this young kid, about saying, "This is what you need to say." And he went out and repeated it. And then, of course, we left there, and the momentum just kept building. And you talked about Ralph Reed. Ralph put together a phenomenal event at the University of Georgia for Mac. He may have told you about it, but he was just, it was just, when we got there to Georgia, we had Howard Baker. And when we got to Georgia and we got to the event, we could not believe, A, the number of young Republicans he had put together. I didn't know we had young Republicans, and the place was just flooded with them. And then we went to the History Village Inn, which is where they had the reception for Baker, and he was just phenomenal, and massive crowds. And that's when we knew that we were headed to winning.
Maybe this is an unfair question,
Right.
but were those pro-Mattingly supporters, or were those anti-Talmadge, anti-good old boy?
No,
and Talmadge had his issues.
Yeah.
obviously.
But I don't think that, these kids really didn't care. I think they just, Mattingly was this young, at that time, nice looking, new fresh breath of air, fresh breath of air. Okay, and he just, I told you my memory's not great, but he had, it was just a wave that caught the country, and also the Jimmy Carter, the anti-Jimmy Carter side that developed among basically the people who had been excluded from the power structure on the Democratic side. And most of these folks, the Republican Party is always the party of the outsiders. And I'd always been part of the insiders. But now I'm joining the outsiders. And it was fun being an outsider. And if you think about it, all the way back to Lincoln, it was the party of the outsider. Lincoln was certainly not the insider, and it's gone through its various versions. But Republicans have always been the people who really just didn't quite fit in. And until, of course, in Georgia, everybody became a Republican suddenly. But and so that was to encapsulate. Yeah, that was, you had Newt Gingrich, who was, charging hard. You had Mac. You had exciting. Bob Bell was on the verge of running for governor. We thought he had a chance. And there's just a lot of excitement building for something that had never existed before.
How much interaction did you have with the state party organization? And by that, the chairman would have been Matt Patton.
Well, I liked Matt, but Mac and Matt Patton hated each other. And Matt sent a check finally, begrudgingly, to the Mattingly campaign for, I think, $100 from the party, maybe $1,000. I think it was. And I remember Mac saying something like, "Tear it up and throw it away." And it was absolutely, there was no Republican Party. Rodney Cook had sort of held one together, but it was just a bunch of same old. And then you had the Reagan group, which was run by Ted Stivers and
Ted
his
and
wife.
Mary.
Yes, and they were probably more supportive of Mattingly, quite frankly. But then, of course, that boomeranged on them when
84 was
when the Fred deal.
Well, 81.
Yeah,
right.
when the Fred deal went down, that which was probably one of the most tumultuous weekends I've ever been through.
It was, yeah. Well, tell me about the origin, if you're the right person. Mm-hmm. Where was the split? Because Matt Patton had an interesting. He was Ford's chairman in '76.
Right.
Switched over to Reagan in 1980 when the establishment of the party was either George Bush or John Connally, sort of the Coverdell, Fred.
Right.
Where did Mattingly fall? In '76, he was chairman, so he couldn't take a position.
Right, although he was a Ford person.
Right.
Yeah. And then he became increasingly a Reagan person. But you got to remember back in the 80s, 1980, the Reagan people were the outsiders of the Republican Party, which was a bunch of outsiders anyway. So I mean, you really had to be outside to be that.
The Carl Gillises.
And
Georgia Republic.
all great people. I mean, not putting them down, they were fabulous. And but it was like the Republican Party's always had a little group of too cool for school types who live in the suburbs or live in Atlanta and Buckhead or whatever. And they just didn't want to have much to do with it. That someone who, and they ironically they treated Reagan at that time, up until the time he got the nomination, a great deal like they treated Donald Trump. And not to compare the two, but Reagan at that time was accused of, having said that trees cause pollution, and people thought he was going to, hit the nuclear button. I mean, I saw a lot of the same patterns in the Trump campaign, absent the eloquence and the dignity and the thoughtfulness of Ronald Reagan. But Reagan at the time wasn't thought of being that. He was thought of as being a cowboy Republican.
Well, candidate Reagan versus President Reagan.
Yeah, he was out there for that time period.
Sure.
I mean, so but so your question would be, I'm sorry, I lost where we were.
So have I. So.
Okay, all right, good. Fine. So,
but it was the party organization, the sort of the state party organization. Mm-hmm. Well, what was as an observer, what was Senator Mattingly's role, Representative Gingrich's role, as elected officials trying to build the Georgia Republican Party in the late 70s and 1980s?
Well, Newt had gone from worrying about the Georgia Republican Party. I mean, he wanted to build a Republican Party, don't get me wrong, but he was also trying to build a national stage at the same time. So Newt was working on the Conservative Opportunity Society and his first book, Window of Opportunity, I think. And so I don't think that, what Newt did is he pushed people like me to get out there and do, and like Bob Irvin and other people to do this and get out there a little faster than we should have. But he believed in that. And
was that the same time as GOPAC?
Oh yeah, well, okay, all the same. I mean, you had GOPAC going on. You had Mattingly in the Senate trying to get his act together up there, which ironically he became probably one of the most liked. He was on there one term, but one of the most liked United States senators by Republicans and Democrats of anybody who's ever served there. And so he was far more effective than people realize, although he was just a one-term guy. But they were both building a Republican Party. You had your. I mean, we were so splintered because we had so many groups. You had the Coverdale faction, and then you had the Mattingly faction, and you had the Gingrich faction, and you had the Isaacson faction. And we didn't have enough room for all those factions because we only have 12 people, so it's sort of hard to divide like that. But I'm joking a little bit, but they.
Well, speaking of factions, 1988, the not religious right. That's not a fair term. The Christian right.
Yeah, we called it the. Back then, it was the Christian Coalition.
Right.
Was the term that
the
was
Pat
used.
Robertson
That's right.
folks.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
I always like to ask, where did these people come from politically? They coalesced behind Pat Robertson, but where were they before? Were they just Joe Frank Harris, who was an incredibly conservative Democrat,
very conservative,
teetotaling, evangelical Christian?
Very
before
polite,
that was a
very polite man. I really don't know. I mean, they were there in the Mattingly victory in the sense that one of the big things that propelled Mattingly to victory was the pro-life movement.
Right.
There was a huge distribution of leaflets on cars at churches all through the state the Sunday before the election that was organized by the moral, I don't know if it was the Moral Majority or who it was. It might have been by...
would have been Falwell's group?
I think it was Falwell's group and some others. But it was extremely successful. And I think some of these folks came from these various groups, from Pat Robertson's group and from Jerry Falwell's group and the like.
This was around the time that you were getting involved with what's the group that you call it? Campaign for Georgia's Future.
Probably the most hidden gem in the history of the Republican Party.
Well, tell me about that.
So I had grown up knowing the Luce group because a lot of my friends from Pace, their parents were members of it. My dad didn't do it because he didn't like politics. But I knew
this was Bob Redfern. Julian LaCroix.
Yeah, and Mr. West, and Ed Noble.
Ed Noble.
Yes, a whole group, great people. Bo Calloway was heavily involved in it too. Bo was, and can't ever leave Bo out talking about a history of the Republican Party because he was sort of our hero through the years, because he actually won the governor's race. Let's face it, but the Campaign for Georgia's Future was an idea that the younger folks didn't matter enough, and we needed to matter more. So we got a whole group of us, and we contributed small amounts of money, but we gave it to candidates, and only to young candidates who were running for. We gave a little bit of money to other candidates, but mostly to candidates who were running for new offices. And our first real candidate that we really heavily got behind was Earl Ehrhart, who won in 1988. And then I don't know if Jack Vaughn won in 88 or not, but Jack was sort of in and out of our group, but Earl was a member of it.
And he beat Joe Mack Wilson.
Yes,
sort of one of Georgia's more colorful political figures.
Exactly. That was a tough race. But in that room, you had of everyone in that room, almost every person who ever joined that was elected to some office in Georgia. And we probably had, I don't want to exaggerate because I can't really remember, but I wanted to say we had 20 members plus. We had some who didn't, but they went on to be prominent in politics in other ways. Sure. But I mean, you had, Judd Hill elected to the Senate, myself. We had Jack. You had Earl. You had, if I really thought about it, prepared for it, the list would just go on and on. Oh, I know John Wiles as another example. I think Don Balfour was part of that. But we had just a massive
Did Mark
group.
Burkhalter come out of...
Mark was not part of that.
He was not.
He was just on the edge of that. But he was about the only one who did. No, Mitch Ganalakis was. Oh, yeah, he's a member too. So it's like if you went in the room then, not realizing what these people were going to end up being and the jobs they were going to hold. I mean, it was all just a bunch of young professionals. And then you go on and it looks like, the who's who of the Republican Party. So it was a pretty cool thing.
Were these mostly, the names we just talked about were mostly Cobb County, Fulton County, suburban?
Well, we had people from other places. I want to say Eric Johnson was a part of it. Trying to think, they didn't come from a long ways out because the party was basically developing in Metro Atlanta, but it was primarily people within the area of Cobb and Gwinnett and Fulton and the like. But we had some from other places. Yeah.
Was this group? It seems like this group was outside the sort of purview of the official state Republican Party. This was not the Young Republican organization.
No, because we wanted to be taken seriously, so we gave real live money, and we got behind candidates. And then when we found the right candidates, we gave him more money. And then the loose group started paying attention to our group, because I think I joined the loose group within, I had to be a member of the loose group by 90, 91, 90, no, right after I'd run for lieutenant governor, 90, 91.
90, 91.
Yeah. And which was a natural thing because I'd always been invited to their meetings and stuff, so it wasn't unusual. But it served its purpose, and we didn't care about the Republican Party or anything else. We were out to put our generation in.
And maybe you already answered this question previously, but I'll restate it. Why was the Republican organization ineffective? Was it a money problem, messaging problem?
Well, it was...
They were just outmatched in a Democratic state?
It was ineffective up until about 1992 because demographics simply weren't in its favor. You had the thing you heard all the time is, well, my daddy was a Democrat. You've heard this, I'm sure, many times. Yeah. So what changed it was the influx of people coming from out of state whose granddaddy had not been a Democrat. And so as Atlanta grew, Metro Atlanta grew, you had more and more people who came from other states and other backgrounds. Well, flew any concept of the Democratic Party. And then as the Democratic Party on the national level continued to drift more and more to the left, these people, I mean, they were already abandoning the Democratic National Party in 1990 when I ran. I mean, I could tell you the number of times I'd go into a city and people say, well, young fellow, I love what you have to say and I want to show you this. Take me over a corner, they'd have a Republican National Committee card. So I vote nationally, I vote Republican. I wanted to say, well, that doesn't do me much good, I'm running statewide. But I got it, I understood that. And I was never in that race to win. The only chance I had of possibly winning was if Joe Kennedy had defeated Pierre. And if Joe had defeated Pierre, well, then all bets were off because we were going to run me as sort of the
He was sort of a rural throwback.
Joe was a sweet, good man, but he just probably was the ultimate good old boy. And he would have been awful on television. He would have been awful. They would have beaten him up to fairly well. I may still not have won, but we would have had a more competitive gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial race had that happened, but it didn't happen.
To be taken serious, you mentioned these folks who would vote Republican for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush,
right.
But you had the likes of like John Stevens,
right?
Joyce Stevens' husband, longtime lobbyist, banker over First National.
Right.
When and how did you convince those sort of power brokers
to move to the Republican Party? It happened. It didn't happen in one time. I mean, it happened over a period of time. I mean, for one thing, I think a seminal moment for us that everybody ignores is when Robert Baker, who we ran as Bobby Baker, who also was a member of Campaign for Georgia's Future, was elected to the PSC because he became the first statewide candidate at state level that we had elected. And then, of course, I think the Guy Milner campaigns brought a lot of people over because Guy, I mean, and obviously I was heavily involved in that first Milner campaign.
94.
The one where we probably won, but we certainly were close against Zell, who I loved. I mean, that was the funniest thing I've ever done, to go campaign against somebody I'd known for 20-something years. And Zell's heart was not in that race, and I knew it. And he had to be convinced to run for re-election, and so it was an odd time. But anyway,
who elaborate on that a little bit more, because there was the one-term pledge against Johnny in 1990,
right?
And then 94 rolls around. The national tide is trending away heavily towards Republicans.
Right.
Newt Gingrich, the revolution.
Right.
Who convinced?
Who convinced Zell to run? Oh, his big mules like Wayne Mason, who I think is a brilliant guy, great businessman and the like. I think they convinced Zell to run again. He was. That's another one who I have to say. I mean, of course, I live in the past now, but
you're talking to a historian.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just perfect, a relic. Zell was just a fantastic, probably the most gifted individual politician I ever knew, and just funny, brilliant. I had more fun between him and Murphy, and the two did not get along, but yet I love both of them. They were just great to be with. So it pained me to have to be running this Milner campaign against Zell, but in a sense, I knew that Zell didn't have his heart in it. And it spoke words about Zell, is that, like, about a week after he lost, we got together and compared notes on the campaign. And then I remember we had the legislative dinner at the governor's mansion. He asked me to sit with him, and he never held it against me. If anything, we got even closer. So, I mean, which is what smart politicians used to do. You didn't take things personally. And he knew you personally. He knew I was there. I was there primarily because my printing company, which I was very involved with at that point. Right. Guy Milner and my dad were very close friends, and Guy's campaign was not going all that well, and so he wanted to know if I could be on loan to the campaign to be a consultant. And my dad wanted to bargain for all his printing. Well, unfortunately, Guy's daughter was a print broker, so we worked some sort of deal. I don't remember how it worked, and so I immediately left the company because I was literally running day-to-day operations by that time to go do this campaign. Yeah.
So you were sort of a general consultant.
I was nobody paid me a dime, but David Schaefer and I ran that campaign.
Right. He had been executive director.
And
he
was the campaign manager, and we both, in the end, I mean, we had other consultants, but our television guy gave up on Guy, and our pollster gave up on Guy, and in the end, it was just me and David trying to figure out how you gut this thing out. I mean, I knew for a fact the race was closer. I could feel it in my gut. And literally, the funniest story I remember is I went upstairs to see Guy, who was, quite frankly, the complete opposite. He was the best candidate I've ever worked with because he did everything you told him to do. I mean, he did.
You recognized that he was new to.
He started out disastrously. We held a thing, I remember, at the Capitol where Guy gave a interview, which we should have never have done, and that's where he made the famous statement, "You won't see me in Vidalia very much." And I know Dick Pettis, who years later worked for me, looked over at me like, and I'm thinking, oh, this is just not good. He's not ready for prime time. But the good thing about Guy is he realized it, and then he got to be great. And I played Zell in the mock debates that we had, and
that must have been fun.
It was, because I could do a pretty good Zell Miller, and I literally just attacked him. And by the time we had the real debates, he was so prepared for Zell. He said, after dealing with you, Towery, Zell was no problem. And so we really, as a debater, I would say we won the first debate on WSB. We lost the debate in Vidalia, and we won the final debate in Albany.
Whose idea was it to have a debate in Vidalia? Was that because of the comment?
Well, okay. Well, let me just tell you.
How did that work?
Let me tell you a little story here. Gordon Giffen probably didn't tell you this, but of course, at that time, I'm running the printing company, but also I'm working as of counsel at
Norman,
at Long Aldrich in Norman, because Newt's now Speaker of the House, and suddenly everybody's wanting to get to Newt. So Gordon and I didn't want to have any debates, and I want to say Maria Supporter was still putting the debates together back then, but she was at the AJC. And so we went over to White Columns to negotiate these debates. And Gordon, we'd throw out a date, and Gordon would say, well, we got to go check with the governor. And they'd come back and say, we can't do it that day. And then they'd throw out a date. I'd say, well, David and I need to go in here and call Guy. We'd just sit in there and do it. If anybody ever looked, we never picked up the phone. We'd come back and say, no, we can't do it that day. I don't really remember how it is that we got into having to have debates, but in the end, we were forced to it. Neither side wanted to debate, and so I think Vidalia was probably our way of, giving something to the Democrats because we had to. We
right.
had a choice.
Depending on who you talk to. The Guy Milner campaigns, 94, 96, mm-hmm. 98, mm-hmm. Has caught a lot of flack.
Right.
As dragging the party socially rightward,
mm-hmm.
especially in 96, mainly 96.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Where do you come down on the impact and the lasting influence of those three Guy Milner campaigns?
Well, in totality, I think Guy deserves a lot of credit for building the Republican Party because he did put a lot of his own money in, and that's why we won the insurance commissioner's race, we won the school superintendent's race. I'm not saying that all turned out great, but nevertheless, and so we had Guy was a major force, and also in bringing other Republicans over the edge in areas where you needed turnout. And the problem for Guy is that every time he got into a race, he became increasingly surrounded by people who were political experts and had their own ideas. Not saying good or bad, but so his style changed each time. We got the original Guy Milner. It was the unvarnished Guy Milner. It was the sort of the Donald Trump of his day, but not with all the other stuff. But it was a controversial campaign, but it's the one where he came the closest to winning. And I never will forget that we had a post, one thing that we did do, and I'll confess this, the flag was an issue with Zell. And ironically, Newt and I had both supported changing the flag, which is one of the great Newt Gingrich stories. I'll tell you this very quickly.
Yeah.
We're about to have our state Republican convention in 1992. Paul's getting ready to run for the U.S. Senate. You've still got this Christian coalition group versus the other. Everybody's fussing and fighting, and somehow I decide I'm going to be the peacemaker and be the chairman of the convention. So the day before that, Newt was not particularly comfortable in Cobb County yet because we had just moved him there.
Right,
so
because of the Murphy redistricting.
So we were at my favorite restaurant in Vinings eating, and the phone rang in Vinings, and it was Zell. And they always knew where to find me, so I go to the phone, and I think it was Zell himself. He said, Matt, in an hour I'm going to have a press conference and say I want to change the Georgia flag.
That is a pretty good Zell Miller.
Well, I can even do better. Matt, I don't know, I'll tell you right now. So he... Zell, I don't do my invitations very much anymore, but he said he was going to change the flag and wanted to change it. And because we had our convention starting, he wanted to know if Newt would endorse it and if I would endorse it. So I go back to the table. You got to remember, Gingrich and I are representing an affluent 6th district area where most people didn't care about the flag. So we sat down. I said, Zell, he wants to know if today you'll endorse it. Newt was going to speak on Friday. I was going to speak on Saturday. Yeah, I said, I don't see any downside to it for us. He said, okay, tell him we'll do it. That's how we work things out. It wasn't exactly, everybody thinks we had all these polls.
Three-dimensional chess.
No, I went back, I called, said, okay. So we went to the Republican convention that night. It opened at the Galleria in Cobb. Newt gave this tremendous speech. I mean, they were just on their feet and going crazy. It was just magnificent. At the very end, he says, and I agree with Zell Miller, we need to change the Georgia flag. And the entire room stands up and boos him. So he leaves. He walks by me. He says, tell Miller that idea about the flag may not be such a good idea. And I remember telling Newt, I said, well, I'm dropping it from my speech tomorrow.
Well, maybe there's something we can tease out of that.
Sure.
What did that say about the Republican Party, the constituency that you were a party leader, you were an elected official, but here were Republicans from all over the state.
Right.
This wasn't just Vinings, Marietta,
well,
East Cobb.
that gets me to that Guy Milner campaign.
Right.
So later in that year, we needed a closer, and we had to do our own ads because our ad guy had quit on us. I mean, he would produce them, but he did not want to. He had fallen out with Guy for whatever reasons, and so we decided. We had at that time, I'm sure it's been described to you. There was a group of us who would run almost every Republican campaign. We would meet as a group.
No, I didn't.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I haven't talked to anybody.
That's
about
existed
that.
forever.
No.
My seat at that table.
Do go on.
My seat at that table came in 1992. And remained through 1996 when I just, that was the end of it.
Was this like Jay Morgan? And
it would always be the same group of people, but it would vary as to who was there. For example, you'd always have Mac Mattingly. You would always have Newt. You would always have Joe Rogers. Usually Frank and David Hanna were involved. You would have Fred, sometimes Fred not, but generally Fred or Alec or both. And you would have some other folks, would come in and out of the, I'm probably not describing the whole group, but Alec was certainly involved in all of that, and whoever the party chairman was. And then,
Rusty Paul.
Right. Or you'd have, at some points, Raina Casey would be involved. So we were sitting at this table going over what can we do, and our concept was, zigzag Zell. We're always talking about how he broke his promises, this, that, and this. So he said he wouldn't run again. He ran again. Blah 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 blah. What's next? And we just showed the Georgia flag lowering on the, and we ran that ad only in South Georgia markets. We didn't run it in any Atlanta market. And this brings me to this is we had a discussion post-mortem, and a prominent businessman who I really admire a great deal, and I'm not going to say who it is. He came in there raising hell about how we'd run an amateur campaign and all this stuff. Finally, I'd had enough, and I said, well, let me just tell you, first of all, we didn't exactly have, none of us were paid anything. But and they kept talking about what we needed to do is we needed to get the vote where the I don't know what the term they were using, but the conservative, the rural vote. So I showed them a map, and I drew a line across it, and I said, in case you don't know, you see every county below this, guy carried every one of them. So you don't know what you're talking about. We lost it in Gwinnett County because we didn't have good ballot security, and that was it.
Well, I'll play devil's advocate and say that Zell Miller historically always overperformed in Gwinnett County with Wayne Mason and Wayne Shackelford.
He did, and I'm not saying
Virgil.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they stole it because I don't think that happened. But what I think did happen is they knew how to press the buttons to get those votes out. I mean, they knew they were behind, and we didn't have. We had a very ragtag statewide system of ballot security and turnout at the last
GOTV
minute.
was not. There were no 72-hour.
Well, I mean,
Karl Rove style.
No, we didn't have that. So it slipped away at the last minute. I think we lost by half a percentage point, maybe, or a percent.
Yeah. I think it's about half.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, for a Republican in 1994 to lose by half a percentage point to a sitting governor was just inconceivable. So I knew that things were going to change at some point, but I didn't know how quickly they would, but I knew that at some point they would.
So how did you get how did you get into the Georgia State House, the Georgia House of Representatives?
That was the great compromise between me and Newt. Newt, by that time, we had become, very involved in helping each other. And Newt had basically, in some groups, endorsed me for Congress in the new Republican district, we call it, in North Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I think in part because he didn't want Johnny. He and Johnny did not get along at all.
Why was that? When you hear Johnny, everybody loves Johnny.
Newt felt like Johnny was too tepid, too moderate, and it was. I mean, I have to say, I don't think Newt treated Johnny very well when Johnny was running for governor. I think there were times when Johnny probably was a little less excited about Newt, and Johnny did not want to run for that congressional seat. It's the other thing. The two things that happened for me was the Newt situation, which I'd known him, for a long, long time, but now I'm dealing with him all the time. And then the other thing is Johnny, who, when I ran for lieutenant governor, Jay Morgan told him to stay as far away from me as possible because it was terrible to have two Republicans from Cobb County. Mm. And so after Johnny lost the race for governor, he became a bit, let's put it this way, it was a hard thing for him because he really, in his mind, thought that was his one shot, I think.
1990?
Yeah. And so Johnny didn't do a lot politically, and I would go have lunch with Johnny fairly often, and we really bonded. I mean, a bond that's never gone away. And so so you were asking me. I'm here. I'm talking about Johnny. I'm talking about, so there was this division, and so when I decided was going to run for Congress, and they do redistricting, they put Newt's number on the district that I was going to run for.
Not the 6th.
The 6th, and Murphy sort of thought that was funny, and this, that, and the other. Well, Newt saw it as a great opportunity because he thought it would be an easier place to run from. And so all of a sudden I start getting from Newt these things about, can you consider, maybe doing something else? This would make things so much easier and the like. And of course, Newt had basically, along with Mac, had created my career. So sure. I'm a pretty loyal person. So I just said, let me think about it. So we basically met, and I said, okay, here's the deal. I'll run. There was a state house seat that Fred Aiken held. Fred was was in a position where we weren't sure he was going to be able to run again because he had some business things he needed to deal with. Mm-hmm. And so we basically struck the deal that I would run for the State House and Newt would move over to the district and I would be his campaign chairman for life. And I thought, that's a pretty bad bargain. It turned out to be damn good. And so to this day, I'm still Gingrich's chairman when he was speaker. So even though we had other people who were co-chairs and this, that, and the other, I mean.
Is this Friends of Newt?
Yeah, Friends of Newt. Fong.
Friends of Newt Gingrich,
yes.
Right.
Which, and so it was a great position to be in because I had total access to Newt when he was speaker. And I, it was a great plus. It probably helped me with my relationships both with Zell and with Tom Murphy because they needed things from federal government.
Right.
Tom had definitely not gotten along with Newt, so I would go get those things for Murphy, and so I'm sure it enhanced my ability far further than it would have been my charming personality.
Well, how did you balance business, state representative, and sort of this emissary go-between?
I was just doing way too much.
You just run yourself ragged?
Yeah, I mean, the printing company was growing by leaps and bounds, and I had brought in digital printing. Mm-hmm. We had no digital printing in Atlanta back then. We had one other place, but not in a major large sheet fed or web company. And so I knew in the end that I'm an only child. I'd be pretty stupid not to be involved in that company. And as you get older, you realize financial security is a hell of a lot more important than politics. But you don't realize that till you get to be about 32, 33, and you realize that, I don't really like not having anything in my bank account, particularly when I know what I could have. So I moved over there. I took the job with Long Aldridge when Newt won because Clay, Long, and Gordon said, we need a Republican. And I knew them, and I liked them. I know them, and I like them to this day. And they were very generous to me. The headline in the Atlanta paper read, Republican lawmaker joins Democratic firm.
I think I've seen that.
Yeah.
That clipping.
How idiotic. I mean, it was, it wasn't a Democratic firm. It was we had plenty of Republicans in there, but it was just, but everything's always so trite, I guess, in media. That's the way it goes. So
got to make a headline.
When I looked at it, I just said, whatever. So I would leave the Capitol in the afternoon. I'd go up to D.C. usually on Wednesdays, and I'd leave in the afternoon. I'd come back the next morning and try to make it in time for 10 o'clock. And it was brutal, but we were doing some great things. We were getting some great clients, and I'd go to the printing company in the afternoon. What happened to me is in those latter years, first 2 years, I was really involved in committees and stuff and everything. But then I started realizing that I was not going to, I didn't know the Republicans were ever going to take over, and B, being in a committee talking about some insurance bill versus being at the printing company, because that's annual report season, and we were one of the larger producers of annual reports in the whole world.
Okay.
So if you're not on top of that, and we're talking about like Coca-Cola's annual report or whatever, this is not some small time deal. And so if you're not on it and getting this stuff through the plant, it's the difference between making millions in a month and losing millions in a month. And so it was stressful.
Well, tell me about your relationship with the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
You came in, Steve Stansel, I think, would have been minority leader, and then Bob.
Which leadership are we talking about?
House. State House, Georgia House.
You mean like the Democratic leadership?
Well, we can talk about Speaker Murphy and Larry Walker, and Terry Coleman, but Republicans first, your own caucus.
I was a little more moderate than they were. They all wanted to put Tom Murphy in jail and this, that, and the other, and I'd been there, done that, didn't work. So I had, they never quite understood why Murphy and I would go to lunch together, or I would sit up at the podium with him in the afternoons or whatever. They had no idea. It only had to do with just a commonality of liking each other and talking about stuff. Yeah, we got some stuff done. And I had 15 or 20 votes, along with Mark Burkhalter and Robin Williams. A group of us had these votes that we could supply to Murphy on certain issues. And they were legitimately reasonable issues. But I wasn't anti the caucus, but I just felt like they were sort of a little more naive in a time period when we couldn't afford to be. We had the Olympics coming. We had a lot of important things going on. Johnny and I were like-minded on virtually everything, so I had Johnny in the Senate. We're not liberals, but I mean, we were a little more open-minded about stuff, and we didn't want to have a battle with the Democrats because it wasn't a battle we could win. I mean, staging Newt Gingrich-style bomb throwing, I mean, Newt knew what he was doing, and he ultimately undid an entire party, but we weren't going to be able to do that. And so we knew that we had to do things a different way and bide our time. And so that's sort of how we worked. I liked Steve. I liked Bob. I liked most of our leaders. But I would say they probably viewed people like myself and some of the others as being a little more friendly with the Democrats, which I don't apologize for. I think they were great leaders, and it didn't bother me at all.
Which is, and this is after you left the House, but
yes.
the irony there is that Bob was essentially ousted for the same criticism.
Right. Well, I mean, it's
and maybe ousted is a strong word, but replaced.
In honesty, the difference between me and Bob was that much. I mean, it was just, and even Steve, it was just that much. It was just a difference of approach, and plus, I mean, I had different things. I was building a company, and I was with a major law firm that was doing things in the city. So I didn't have the luxury to call people names and throw things and all that stuff. Not that they did. Bob was. It sounds like I'm selling them short. I mean, Steve was an excellent leader. He was very a very good man. And then Bob is brilliant, just absolutely brilliant.
You left the State House in '95 to go back to the business. How did Insider Advantage come about?
Well, they're missing a big part. I left in '95. Well, my last session was '95, so it was 96.
Okay.
No, wait, hold on a second. No, we're wrong about that. I left at the end of '96. I served through the Olympics.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was really involved with the Olympics, extremely involved.
Let's talk about the Olympics for a second.
Yeah.
Here you are, a Republican elected official,
right,
in City of Atlanta, Metro Atlanta area.
Right.
Tell me about the pragmatic business progressive spirit that sort of the Olympics was a showcase of, and what we were just talking about, where the 1990s is hard-nosed politics, Gingrich era style Republican
but we all
politics.
had to come together for that, and it was a very difficult situation. So Johnny and I were sort of put as ad hoc representatives of the Republicans for the Olympic effort. And so we were tapped to go to Washington. We met with President Clinton with a large group, with Billy and others. That was the first time I met Bill Clinton. And anyway, that was a funny time. So anyway, we Isaacson and I go into a Brooks Brothers, and we say we like a tie, and we end up buying the same damn tie, not thinking that we're going to show up wearing it next week. But those were fun times, and we got a big kick out of those days. But the serious side of it, so at Long Aldridge, I was tasked with the job of helping make sure that the lobbyists for ACOG, was it called ACOG?
Yep, ACOG.
Right,
yeah.
ACOG, were able to get the funding they needed. And they had a great lobbyist in Cindy Gillespie, who, of course, has gone on to be very prominent, very close with Mitt Romney, for example. Cindy was our lobbyist, and most of the work was done out of another law firm, but King and Spalding. But we were hired and put on retainer basically to make sure ACOG got their money. And a lot of the money for the Olympics comes from the Department of Defense bill, because you don't allocate money out of the general fund for an Olympics. Back then it had to come from various committees. And so things were going along okay, except we had two things happen. We had the anti-gay resolution with the Cobb Commission, which was a huge disaster for us that we had to deal with.
The beach volleyball. That was
Yeah, well, not just that, the torch run. And I mean, Newt was livid when Billy called and said that they couldn't do that in Cobb. I mean, he was livid. In part for this reason, before that, I got a phone call one night, 2 in the morning from Cindy, very distressed. And she said, they've just written all the money for the Olympics out of the DOD markup. So I had to call Newt at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is not something I was looking forward to, and say, Newt, hear me out, explain what was going on. I was hoping he was awake. He said, I'll call you in the morning. I went to sleep, didn't get up till, I think I slept till about 10 because I'd been up so late. Phone rings and it's Gingrich, and he says, Towery, I've restored all the money for the Olympics, and I'm going to put so-and-so on the phone to explain to you everything so you'll sound like you know what you're doing, which is not unlike him. We've always done that to each other.
It's the old history professor.
Well, I've done it to him too. I mean, we have literally, we've gone back and forth, but quite lovingly all our lives. So Mattingly's the same way. I mean, they always give and take too. But it was an odd time because you had Zell, and you had the speaker, and you had what Billy was doing, and people like Lindsey Thomas, who was the governmental affairs person.
Who was Campbell?
Yeah, Bill was mayor. It was a miracle it got pulled off. I mean, it was a great credit to Billy Payne and and Pierre, who was also integral in the whole thing. So, I mean, everybody was pulling their weight beyond measure, and it was sort of like a team deal where, I've never seen a team come together better. And we weren't always, we didn't all meet together. It was like we did our little parts. But that was coming as well. So we couldn't sit around and act like a bunch of yahoos when we had the Olympics coming. And that's how Johnny felt about it, how I felt about it, Pierre felt about it. Most of us who were sort of more Mark Burkhalter felt that way. We all felt like, hey, we got to get this thing done.
So that takes up to 96,
Mm-hmm.
And you finish with the.
And I go to the printing company because in the last year, to give you an idea of how my life had changed about politics, Tom Murphy called me in the afternoon, and I must have been a cell phone. I guess we had flip phones back then. I must have answered the phone, and he said, Matthew, what are you doing? He said, are you in your office? I said, yeah, I was in my office at the printing company. And he said, well, I need you to come meet with me and the boys. We got some bills we got to talk about. And this was the chairman. And he wanted me to talk about some of the bills and what I thought could fly and couldn't fly. And I had that sort of, didn't mind doing that. So I get in my car, and that's back in the time period when you could actually still race around with your your thing in the back and not get pulled over. So I made it in record time, 10 minutes. I'm from Fulton Industrial to the Capitol, and I parked right next to the governor's.
You also can't do that.
Shack. No, obviously you can't. No, I wouldn't dare. Are you kidding me? I'm such a bad driver now. I'm a typical old man in Florida. I drive like 30 miles an hour. But
not in a golf cart.
I'm not in the golf cart. I'm still in my car. So anyway, I get there, and I get in there. Murphy looks sort of irritated with me. He said, I thought you said you were in your office. And I said, I was in my office. I said, at the printing company. And he said, oh, I forgot. That's right. You're over there making money instead. So he joked about it. But I spent all my time there. And so I left, and our company was on fire. We were just growing by leaps and bounds, and all over the country. And we had new companies coming in like UPS that had bolstered our level even more. We had hundreds of employees. We were very profitable. We embraced digital printing, which wasn't as easy as it sounded like back then. It was really sort of blue smoke and mirrors. Then all of a sudden, I get out of the legislature. 1 month out of it, I get a phone call, and it's a big, large company wanting to buy us. So I sign one, non-disclosure, meet with them. Then another one wants to. This is a time period when printing companies were still valuable, and they were paying high dollar for it. So ultimately, this gets you to insider advantage. In July of 1997, I had a proposal to buy us out that was so astoundingly outrageous that I was in Houston meeting with Icon Business Products. They had no business buying us, but the president, I was meeting with him. I remember it, they had phone booths then. I was in the phone booth. My folks at Pricewaterhouse, who were handling the sale, read it to me, and I said, meet me at the airport, and I will sign that letter of intent. So I think they were the next day. So we signed it immediately. And so we were sold by September, and I didn't have anything to do except my Long Aldridge stuff. So I kept doing that, but that was going back and forth to Washington, and I enjoyed it, but I missed the management of a really big company, or at least on my scale, big company, probably considered about medium size, but in our industry was big. And so Insider Advantage started when I realized that what happened is this. I was offered a partnership at Long Aldridge. Keith Mason and I were both offered one.
Right.
From Clay Long, who's one of the smartest men I've ever known and just a super nice guy. And I told Clay, I said, I don't think I'll be a very good partner because I'm not going to want to get up. I represented the government of Puerto Rico, for example. I said, I'm not going to want to get up and fly to San Juan on a moment's notice. I just don't have that incentive. So I stayed of counsel, and then after a period of time, I left to start a thing with Pierre Howard called Special Corporate Strategies, where the two of us, now here's a guy who ran against me for lieutenant governor,
right? And
we're together working in a company. And we signed up all sorts of clients that we're consulting with. We were just doing gangbusters. And then the internet phase came, and I don't know how it came up. We decided, well, let's take this knowledge that we have about government and put it online. And that's how Insider Advantage started.
We'll get into Insider Advantage and the sort of the internet.
Yeah, sure.
The .com. We're getting into my self-awareness of knowing that period.
Right.
But what was the lobbying? What was the presence of lobbyists in Georgia back then? I mean, you had Skin over at Georgia Link or Capital Link.
They had all just started. I mean, I think so. The presence of lobbyists when I was leaving the legislature were still like the John Thomases, the Mo Thrashes, the
Abbott Masseys.
Well, I mean, let me be blunt. I mean, the proliferation of lobbyists came when the Republicans took over. We didn't have hordes of lobbyists at the Capitol. We had the same old people every year. And so that came when the Republicans took over.
And it begs the question, why?
Well, I'll tell you why. The Republicans sat back, and particularly the newer ones. I mean, Glenn was relatively new.
Glenn Richardson.
Yeah. And I like Glenn. And he and I we stayed in touch even through the bad time period he went through. But Glenn and his group, they had only seen the Democrats from a time period of what they saw was just brutality. And also, they saw their excesses. They saw that they had their private dinners and this, that, and the other. So when they took over, they figured, well, hell, then we ought to be doing the same thing, except they took it to like a new level. And that changed politics in Georgia, but it meant that you had to have more lobbyists down there, and lobbyists were entertaining more. I mean, I really did not go out to dinner very often when I was in the legislature. I mean, it's not like I had people every night saying, oh, we want to take you to Bones or Chops or whatever. You'd occasionally get those offers, but at halftime, hell, I could get a good meal. I didn't have to go get somebody to buy it for me, you wanted to get home because my kids were young and you just had other things to do. And like I said, I'm out at the printing company. I left most evenings, my evening ended at the printing company because that was where to this day, that's what has allowed me the freedom to do what I do. So it just all changed. Let's put it that way. And I think so lobbying back in those days was very much the sort of rudimentary lobbying that you saw back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. But it changed in the 90s. It changed a little bit with Roy because Roy was a more activist governor, and Bobby was definitely an activist. I know Most of these guys I knew since I was a kid. Bobby Kahn and I debated against each other in high school.
Oh, that would have been a sight to see.
We went to debate workshops together. I mean, Randy Evans was debated against me. We knew it. I mean, that's what I told you in the old days. You're only one person separated from knowing everybody, and so it was it's an interesting time period to come along. And so Roy and Bobby, of course, Roy had the office next to me in the legislature, and it was a family thing, whether it was Democrat or Republican. You felt like, but I saw things change as the Republicans took over, because the Republicans brought in all new people that nobody knew, so you had to have lobbyists to deal with them. A whole new style where they took the old style of Murphy, blew it up 8 times bigger, and they went heavily to from the top down, which has probably been the biggest mistake in my judgment the Republicans have done, and in the end it will be a disaster for them, is their top-down management style that they have now in the legislature.
Is that? Are you speaking primarily about the Georgia House, where
Both.
you have David Ralston?
Well, both. I mean,
or does it start with the governor, with Governor
well, it talks
Deal
to
or
everybody.
Governor,
Well, when
Governor
Sonny
Dew?
came in, I mean, Sonny had been a Democrat when I was in the legislature, and a lot of times we'd speak at the same forums. And I liked Sonny; he was very good to me. But Sonny had a very top-down way about him, and then that's not that other governors hadn't. So it's not. I don't want to be unfair to Sonny. It really was more in the legislature. Is when what happened is these guys took over, and by the time David took over, he had to be top-down because Glenn had become top-down. Glenn felt like he was doing what Murphy did, except he wasn't doing what Murphy did. Murphy let his committee chairman help decide things, and he also let individual members of the House, both Democrat and Republican, introduce any bill they wanted. There was no restriction. I mean, I got bills. I passed bills all the time, and one of which, Murphy fought me on the floor of the House, and we went out to dinner after it was over. It was a different time period. But now what's evolved on both the House and the Senate side is, and I look at it from afar. I remember I'm in Florida, so I'm not here, so I only know anecdotally what I see. But what I see is that nothing moves in the Senate unless the lieutenant governor says it's okay. Nothing moves in the House unless the speaker says it's okay. Then the chairman have to say it's okay. I mean, I don't think anybody drops a bill now unless they know that they're not going to go off to the gulag for dropping the bill, which is, in my judgment, not good.
Well, I guess that gets us to this portion of the interview, which is why were Georgia Democrats, and we can talk a bit more because I think you've already answered the question about Georgia Republicans as a governing party, but why were the Georgia Democrats able to hold on in this state so long when we already talked about how presidential level voting had left the Democrats long ago?
Demographics. Georgia has a very, and by the way, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So the demographics are shifting again, and the Republicans will be out at some point, and I predict probably sooner than they think. The Democrats held on because you had a rural South Georgia where education was sparse, where opportunities were low, and where tradition was to vote Democrat. And the National Democratic Party had not moved to a level that it was viewed to be so liberal that it was incongruent with their voting Democrat on the state level. Then North Georgia changed entirely. North Georgia was a defiant. North Georgia's known, people are known for being quiet. They're mountain people, as Zell Miller will tell you. They keep to themselves. They're not going to tell you what they think, but they generally are. You got to blast concrete to get a North Georgia prototypical voter, particularly male voter, out of whatever he's been doing forever. And the creep of Atlanta, as Atlanta started creeping up to North Georgia and then down, further down. And let's face it, there's a constant movement of the demographic that votes Republican, which tends to be white, which tends to be a higher income bracket, which tends to have a higher educational level, at least did. That's changing as well. So in that time period when that started to change, that's when the state flipped. But until that the demographics changed enough, the Democrats could always rely on a black vote that if they turned it out in a gubernatorial year, which they had trouble doing, they would win. In a presidential year, they had no problem with that, but the problem is that you'd have a white vote in a presidential race that would overwhelm them. That's how it started to go Republican. But the demographics moved far more quickly than the Democrats expected it to. Mm-hmm. And Roy was a victim of that. I mean, Roy Barnes was, in my judgment, a very good governor who took on extraordinarily difficult issues. The problem was Roy loves politics. I mean, he just loves it, and so does Bobby. And that was the part that ended up getting them in the end, because they didn't realize that talking about the Northern Arc that was going to upset Republican voters, or that the flag was still going to irritate the South Georgia voters and the like. So and it just all came together at the last second. I mean, for all real reasons, Roy should have been reelected. I mean, he was an excellent governor. He was a hands-on governor, a smart man, brilliant man. But the demographics just shifted. And I suspect that's what's going to happen. When Georgia goes back to being a Democratic state, which it will, they'll be caught flat-footed. Republicans won't realize that Cobb went Democrat, that Gwinnett went Democrat, that DeKalb remained Democrat, that North Fulton even begins to start to change a little bit over time. The votes move further up. The people moving in now, they're not the same. When you say people from out of town helped create the Republican Party, that demography is now changing as well, because as you get millennials who come here, what they're seeing on TV doesn't put Republicans in a flattering light. And they view themselves as being the new sophisticated voter. And so I just think that, I'll tell you the Achilles heel for this state, and this is where the Republicans will, if they lose, this is why they will lose. Zell Miller, when he created the Hope Scholarship, did the single smartest thing any politician has ever done in the history of the state of Georgia. It was brought to him by Jimmy Carville, and James came up with that idea. It was a brilliant idea. He gave it to Clinton in a watered-down scale on the national level in '96. But Zell was the test case, and I watched it. I watched the debate about the lottery, and I watched some debate about the Hope Scholarship. And in the end, the Hope Scholarship is the most popular thing the state has ever done. I was on the lottery oversight board. You cannot keep a lottery funding a Hope Scholarship when you have such inflated costs of universities. I'm not blaming the university system. I'm just saying it's happened all over the country.
Right. It's not
everywhere.
A Georgia.
It's not a Georgia thing. This is everywhere. And so you can't squeeze enough tickets out of, or come up with enough fun games to keep that going. And the Democrats are talking about the Hope Scholarship, but the Republicans this year, I haven't heard one of them talk about it. And so I'm not saying that in the year 2018 the Republicans will be defeated, but what I am saying is that their window of opportunity, as Newt would say, is going to start closing. And I believe that were I still a Georgian, which I'm not, but that I would probably, if I didn't have an untimely death, I would die under a Democratic governor just like I was born under one.
Well, you've talked about, one of the questions I always ask is what are the biggest risks for the Republicans as a governing majority? And we've talked about sort of the top-down.
Right.
Others have talked about complacency.
Right.
Demographics. Why do you think it is that the birth of the modern Republican Party in Georgia, Cobb County, North Fulton County, right, highly educated,
right,
upwardly mobile.
Right.
I'm talking to a Cambridge University graduate.
Yeah, that 5 cents will get you, 50 cents will get you nothing, but go ahead.
But the face of the Democratic Party now is, if you look at the 2016 presidential election, and we can talk about how that is an outlier or not, mm-hmm, or a harbinger.
Right.
Upwardly mobile, young, college educated, especially adding to that the base of the Democratic Party in Georgia, right, which right, is African Americans.
That's right.
Liberals.
That's right.
Liberal whites in Athens and places like that. But the young professional cohort, yes, that you mentioned, millennials and
right,
30, the 18 to 34. age group.
Right.
Why that switch over? You touched on it briefly, but
well, let me give it a good example. My son. So part of what Insider Advantage did, and then we moved it over to Opinion Savvy, was we polled for the TV stations in Atlanta, and then for we were actually, Insider Advantage was the first polling firm for Politico. Most people don't remember, but we did the polling. I did the polling for the first presidential race for Politico.
Which was that?
It was
04 or 08?
No, it was 08.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and we got it right too. I mean, you always got these idiots who do these scoring things, and since we're from Georgia, we always had to get an F on their deal. But in reality, I mean, we did a great job for Politico, and they had us even polling all the way down to counties that they considered were going to be. So I'm doing Washoe County, I'm doing Bucks County in Pennsylvania. Like, we got that right. So I mean, that was really
Chester, Montgomery.
Yeah, that was some tough damn sledding in a year when you had a Barack Obama running. But my son, who grew up in Atlanta, went to school in Canada at Queen's College, came back, actually understands polling. That's what he does for a living. He truly has degrees in this. We fell into it at Insider Advantage, and had to learn and just swim through it. But he did the polling for the Fox affiliates this last presidential election in the various states, and I did the commentary. So we're doing Pennsylvania, Texas, Georgia, Florida, this, that, and the other. My son is a very confirmed Democrat. Thinks very little Donald Trump. And I'm not putting him down. I mean, I actually respect the fact that my son has a different attitude than I have, and he probably wouldn't like me telling what his politics is. Now, he polls straight down the middle, but he's different, and I see this in millennials, in that they have different things that they're interested in. I mean, it's why restaurants, interestingly enough, like Olive Garden or what other one? Just any number of these restaurants. They're having trouble getting people to come eat because millennials don't go to these restaurants.
The mid-scale casual, Red Lobster.
Yeah, well, that definitely ain't going to be a millennials thing. But even more upscale, like Outback, they're having real trouble. So
the Darden brand.
Right. The reason they're running into trouble is not because the millennials are eating at other places, but increasingly they're having Uber Eats or whatever pick the food up and bring it home and just eating with friends. They're online a lot more. There's a different lifestyle for millennials than there is for my generation, and that's going to seep into their politics. And they don't. Everything has a way of overplaying its hand, and I think the Republican brand is in Georgia will at some point, they'll just wake up one day and they'll start losing seats. And someone, what I usually find happens is this. When we took over, Republicans, when I was a Republican, they predicted we'd get 8 seats and we ended up getting 20. That big banner 1992 year, we went from like 20-something members in the House to 60-something. Mm-hmm. I was part of that group. Well, I was just like, nobody expected that. And then, of course, when you saw those bigger in 2004, you had the big acceleration again. So it's going to happen in reverse, because if you look at what's going on in Cobb and what's going on, it's not just be 1 or 2 seats. You're going to see whole delegations flip. And then when those delegations flip, you're going to see other areas start to flip. And then when you start seeing, like Forsyth County, Cherokee County, let me use Cherokee. Cherokee right now would be thought of still as a bedrock Republican county.
Sure.
In 10 years from now, it won't be. Because population has to expand. And as it continues to expand, people are going to go to other areas that are less expensive. Mm-hmm. You can't just buy in Midtown Atlanta. Nobody can afford it. So as that happens, you're going to see areas that, look at Gwinnett County. I mean, Gwinnett County was 15 years ago. If you told anybody Gwinnett County was going to be anything but a Republican county, or Cobb, both of which will not be Republican counties within the next, Gwinnett won't be after this next election cycle, in my judgment. Cobb may or may not be as well. So majority delegation. So you got real changes going on here. And so we live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Well, do you think, 2016, mm-hmm. Donald Trump's name's come up
Right.
several times, and
Right.
obviously this is sort of beyond the scope of a two-party Georgia
Right.
oral history, but I think it helps inform it.
Right.
How was Donald Trump able to win the nomination? Was it purely the fact that there were 16, with the exception of Jeb Bush, so-so candidates?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're all so-so.
Or is it more complex than that?
It was something that I don't think a lot of people, I saw it in the polling. And I wrote that column in 2014 that said, they put, you would appreciate this. When you write a column, you don't get to choose the headline.
Nope.
Every newspaper chooses their own headline. So most places chose a thing that said why Donald Trump should run. But what I was really arguing is why Donald Trump could win. And of course, Trump grabbed it, tweeted it out, never forgot it. When he came into Georgia, I was there. First thing he talked about was my column. But what he never really understood, because I've talked to Trump maybe 5 times in my life, very polite man behind the scenes, very thoughtful. I can't explain the rest of him, but I can say this. He knew exactly, intuitively, what the polling was telling me, and that is this country was sick and tired of normal politicians. They had had enough. They'd seen the John McCains. They had seen the Bob Doles. They had seen the Bill Clintons. They had seen the even Barack Obama. They wanted something way out of the box because there was a built-up, pent-up feeling that among the groups that people particularly say go for Clinton, for Trump, it was a pent-up feeling that they were just not being heard. And so they didn't care how crazy he acted or what he said. And they thought every time he called Marco Rubio, little Marco or whatever, they thought it was funny. And they don't care. And they understood him. It's the rest of the folks who didn't, because the rules changed. And the rules are changing in politics. These days these days of where we used to have these perfect politicians, wrapped up, that's coming to an end. And people are the norm is going to be to expect someone who's ready to just slash and burn in one direction or the other. It may not be the same ideology. It may be totally different.
Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely. If you were to tell me Bernie
Not
Sanders,
to conflate Bernie Sanders.
no,
and Donald Trump,
let me just say,
anti-establishment.
if you were to tell me that Bernie Sanders might be the president in 3 years, I would not be shocked in the least. Because if I could see the Trump wave coming, I can certainly see the counter wave coming. Now, I also know that polling is so screwed up now that it doesn't really, they're having a hard time polling Donald Trump because there are just numerous flaws in polling now that the media establishment, they think should be the norm. For example, cell phone interviews. Mm-hmm. You can't do a cell phone interview. If you're trying to capture someone under the age of 30 on a cell phone, on a live call, and you think they're going to answer a 60-question poll, that's nonsense. So what they've done is they've had to create, in essence, what would you call them, like giant focus groups, panels. So you have to be someone who says, yes, I'm willing to take a phone call. I'm willing to spend 20 minutes. Call me on my cell phone. Well, you're usually probably drilling right down to the people who are nuts, because that's the only one who's going to have any time to do it. So it's why these polls are all off. You look at the poll, the race in Pennsylvania. To put it in context, there was a special election in Pennsylvania in March of 2018. The Republican was expected to win this big Trump district.
The Rick Saccone, Connor Lamb.
Rick Saccone and Connor Lamb. Connor Lamb, a far more attractive candidate, far more dynamic, clearly the better candidate of the two. But the polls had Connor Lamb leading by as much as 10 points or more. It ended up being by 300 points. Why were those polls so off? Because the mainstream media groups, and all of the media groups, Fox included, everything, they all believe that they've caught on to this concept that you have to have cell phones included. And you can't do that. We've gone past the cell phone. We've gone to the smartphone, where someone will answer something if it shows up on their smartphone and take 5 minutes to answer it. I do that on stuff. Most people do. And that's sort of what my son has started doing, others will do. We're going to leapfrog right over the cell phone to a different type of polling, because landlines are dying. But what I'm saying is you're not capturing the Trump supporter, and they're overweighting the polls.
I was going to say, is it a weighting
yes,
issue?
it's an issue. And then you have these purebreds in polling who say, oh, well, you shouldn't weight a poll. It should just be naturally what you receive. Well, if you poll, for example, there was a poll done in Georgia in the last month and a half that showed Donald Trump less popular in Georgia than he is nationally. That's inherently impossible. I mean, there's no way that he's less popular in the state of Georgia than he is nationally. And the flaw in the poll is that almost a majority of the poll was cell phone. Well, if you garbage in, garbage out. And so that's what happened. Fortunately, I don't have to worry about any of that anymore. I don't care, but I mean, it's fun to observe it and look at it.
Well, I mean, you've also, I mean, the aggregators now with 538, for example. Right. I mean, Nate Silver's is probably a polling snob, I guess you would say.
Who has projected everything in the wrong direction for years, but go ahead.
But it gets to that issue of polls supposed to be useful as opposed to, it strikes me as now polls are just, that's a breaking news headline now. Oh, there's a new poll out from Monmouth or Suffolk or PPP.
And there's an interesting thing about polling, and I find about candidates in this. Candidates always want the poll to show that they're ahead. They should always want the poll to show them losing.
Intensity and...
Absolutely. And so, I mean, look at what happened to Hillary Clinton. I mean, I am convinced that if she really wants to know what happened to her, an overly out-of-touch media and people who run the polling units, political units, crowned her president 2 weeks too early. And when that happens, the other side gets more fired up. They turn out. Your side decides, maybe, maybe maybe I'll vote for Hillary, maybe not. I mean, that's what happened. She had a coronation before she was, proclaimed queen.
And we'll talk about the recent special elections and everything like that.
Sure.
But sticking with the topic of Donald Trump.
Sure.
Insofar as you can define Donald Trump's politics,
right? How
do you think, and to what extent will this trickle down to the state level, state party, gubernatorial? We're in a gubernatorial election year. Those statewide candidates, congressional candidates.
I think we are. It's entirely different in the sense that Trump is either far more mad or far more sophisticated than the local politician. Yeah, that sounds just like something Newt would have said. I think that my decision is still out as to whether Donald Trump is the smartest man in the history of politics or not, because the tweets, although they are obnoxious and they cause problems and the like, they have been about the only way that he's been able to create a news agenda opposite what everyone's seeing on TV, because he knows as president, if he tweets it, even CNN or MSNBC has to report it. Now, they got to rip it apart, but he'll still be heard. Is that pretty smart? Probably. It's not my style. I don't need to do any of that stuff. But then again, I came up from a traditional political background. And I think a lot of these guys running for office now, look at these state candidates, they just want to lope into office. I mean, none of them are really throwing any fire and brimstone. They're all worried about, are they going to be attacked in the newspaper about this, that, or the other thing? Well, in reality, the public doesn't really care anymore. I mean, they just don't care. I mean, literally, the president of the United States has been accused of sleeping with a porn star. And, there's a pretty good reason to think it might be true. And yet his numbers are going up. So I'm not saying that's
this
right
isn't
or wrong.
1984. This isn't Gary Hart and
this
monkey
isn't,
business.
Well, we've had the public has been desensitized by Trump to a lot of the stuff they used to pay attention to. And I think the genie's out of the bottle. I don't think it's going back. So, people are going to judge their politics based on other things, and they may not be looking for the perfect candidate anymore. And I think that's probably the thing that we don't people don't get, the perfect candidates out there are the ones who get beat. I look at Marco Rubio. I've known Marco since before he was Speaker of the House in Florida. And, Marco's the perfect candidate. He's buttoned down, straight-laced, this, that, and the other. But he may never get anywhere other than where he is.
Ed Gillespie in Virginia.
Ed Gillespie. I mean, it's just one after another. It's just being the great example. Also being John Kasich. I mean, John is a great guy, very smart. He was one of Newt's top lieutenants.
Mm-hmm.
He's a good governor of Ohio. They love him up there. If he runs against Trump, Trump is going to eat him up and spit him out. And I don't think he realizes that. When you have a base like Trump has, the more that he appears to be attacked, the more they can be formed. Look at Richard Nixon. I mean, Nixon really was the closest to Trump in 98 to 72. Everybody thinks Nixon just got all this great treatment. Well, if that was the case, why did Spiro Agnew give the speech talking about, the media and how terrible they were? Well, he did it for a reason, because they were getting, slaughtered every week by the media. Nixon won in a landslide. I mean, he ultimately undid himself, but would he have undone himself now? No, probably. He would have gone and burned the tapes, and that'd be it.
Well, Pat Buchanan told him to burn the
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, I mean, it's no different than deleting emails, I mean, it's just sort of like, okay, let's get him out of here. I just think that he's just, we are at different time periods and things have changed. But I can't predict the future of the National Republican Party, but I can predict in Georgia the demographics that Georgia will probably end up being a Democratic state again before certainly I'm gone.
Well, let's get to that. There was a special election. We're in the 5th district right here, but just north of here, in the 6th district.
That's right.
Newt's old district, Tom Price, Secretary Price.
It's
changed a couple times.
Yeah, but still, general concept. Yeah.
Right. The northern and western suburbs.
Right.
John Ossoff.
Yes.
A political newcomer.
Right.
Nobody knew him.
Right.
He was on Hank Johnson's staff.
Right.
But
right.
48.1% of the vote in a special election.
Yeah.
Which historically special elections in or runoffs in Georgia do not benefit Democrats.
That's right.
How and why? And is that an outlier against Karen Handel, or is that a harbinger of things to come?
Harbinger of things to come. I think had Ossoff's ads been better in the last 2.5 weeks of his campaign. I mean, he over-Ossoffed himself.
And by that you mean he was just sort of the nondescript, the technocrat.
Well, and he came on
inoffensive.
It came on also as being too pandering, and people know when they're being pandered to. I mean, I thought he was an excellent candidate, and I said it, because that's the last thing I covered, and I just said, hey, guys, this guy's going to be bodacious. You better believe it. And everybody thought I was crazy, but. A little bit more in a couple of directions, he could have won that race. Handel also managed to avoid what she had never avoided before, and that is not making herself the mean one. And she didn't tell him to put his big boy pants on or any of the stuff she'd done before. And that's just Karen. She's blunt. That's the way she is. So she won. But I think it is a harbinger of things to come. I think I will tell you, I'll be very blunt. A lot of these congressmen who now represent Georgia, I don't even know. I used to know that all the congressional delegations, I don't know who these people are. They weren't around when I was around. If they were, they had to be in the back of the room somewhere. God bless them now, they're leaders of Congress. I think that's great. But, things change. And at some point, things will change again. And you'll see, the only thing that won't change is you're always going to have in this. Well, I shouldn't say that. I do think that something could happen down the road that will really shock us all, and that is in another 10 years, Atlanta may become a city that has a better chance of electing a liberal Republican than Cobb County has of electing a Republican at all. And the reason I say that is the regentrification of Atlanta, the shift in population. I mean, Mary Norwood was not a particularly compelling candidate this time versus 8 years ago. And she almost won again.
400 votes.
400 votes. And look, when your machine is down to being able to produce only 400 votes, your machine's dying. And so I think that probably what's going to happen is, my guess is in Atlanta, the first thing that will happen is that a white gay candidate will be elected as mayor, because that's the consolidation of the two groups that would have the most power. I've always thought that if you had a really strong gay white mayor candidate, they would win. We haven't seen that yet, and Kathy, if we had some other people run, it didn't work out, but I think that could be coming. But I think 20 years from now, when I'm 58, 78 years old, if I come back to Atlanta, I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility that we'd have like a John Lindsay type, a little before your time.
A John V. Lindsay.
John V. Lindsay type mayor of Atlanta, and maybe a city council that's a little different looking than it is now. I mean, I think those days are coming, and it's very interesting.
Well, Massachusetts, Charlie Baker,
exactly,
the most popular governor in the United States,
yep.
is a liberal Republican from Massachusetts,
exactly.
or Hogan in Maryland.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, and if you think about it, and I sort of, as we start to wrap up, let me make a note here. So the Republican Party, we were originally considered the party of open government, anti-good old boy, let everybody talk and have their ideas, free flow of ideas. Don't have big business, or don't have lobbyists. We're not the backroom group. Look at what in Georgia it's turned into. Complete opposite. It's top down. We don't want to tell you anything. You'll find out when your bill comes up. I'm not being critical. It's just the reality that's there. The governor, lieutenant governor, speaker are going to get together and work it all out. Gee, what does that sound like?
Was it the Green Door?
Yeah, the Green Door Committee. And believe me, the Green Door Committee, there's nothing to it. It's a bunch of old guys who were chairman of committees trying to work out amongst themselves what they thought they could pass or not. So really, when I was flying in that car to go to that meeting that day, I guess you could have said that was the Green Door Committee. But it was nothing to it. And but now everything is even more centralized. And I'll tell you, I'm going to make a note about this. One of the things that has most distressed me about the Republicans in Georgia is that everybody has a chief of staff. I don't care who you're talking to, they've got a chief of staff. If they're a committee chairman, they've got a chief of staff. They have their own legal counsel. That is a proliferation of government that went completely opposite of anything we ever believed in the Republican Party. So when I see these little things create, you got to go through this person, and then they've got this chief of staff and that chief of staff. Murphy had one person sitting outside his door.
Steve Anthony sitting there.
Well, it was Steve, and actually, you want to know who officially was the chief of staff for Tom Murphy? Lunell Jones.
Oh.
Yep. And Steve had another title, but I mean, it was just Steve and Lunell. And I found that out when I had asked Murphy to be on appropriations, and I guess I gave it to Steve and I had mentioned it to Murphy this is when Newt was speaker and he was making his new appointments and everything. So I'm on an airplane and I get the committee assignments, and none of my committees have been changed. So I flew back the next day and I went in and I said, "Hey, boss," I said, "how come I didn't get put on any committees I asked for?" He said, "What did you ask for?" I said, "I wanted either rules or appropriations." He said, "Who'd you give it to?" I said, "I gave it to Steve." He said, "Well, Lunell's my chief of staff." Now, to be fair to Steve, because Steve really did function as a chief of staff, I'm not putting him down at all, but Murphy halfway thought the other person there was the one to take. In other words, it was not a well-organized hierarchy, is what I'm trying to say. Not to put Steve down. Steve really did do a lot. He would do the seating charts and this, that, and the other, and I always thought he was chief of staff. But here you have a speaker who thought that this woman who sat outside his office was the person you're supposed to go to talk about this stuff. Now, maybe he was trying to fob off the fact that he hadn't given me the committee, but I was on the committee the next day. But the real story there is that, so you had Steve and Lunell and nobody else. Now you go to an office, whether it's speaker's office, lieutenant governor's office, you got people everywhere. You got 8 levels of hierarchy. You got legal counsel, you got chief of staff, you got this person, that person, and
little party organizations in
within
every office.
themselves. And there's it's over in the lieutenant governor's office and the governor's office. And by the way, the last executive secretary for a governor was Bobby Kahn. He held the title.
98 to 01.
And then from that point on, they started calling him chief of staff. So that, to me, is the demarcation of where, and I'm not being critical of the Republican Party, I'm just saying this is what has happened. We're a much bigger state. We have a much bigger population. It's more complicated. Still the same small number of days to get things done. But I think the Republicans in the end, the demographics and the walling themselves away from their own constituencies, which are the legislators and others, that'd be the death knell of the Republicans for a while.
What about the party organization? I wrote a dissertation about the growth of the party organization.
Right.
Where you had to have this party that could finance and coordinate all these campaigns and recruit, target races. How important are political parties in 2016, 2017?
Well, they were very important in the 90s when we had people like Ellett who, Ellett literally was there, constantly, and we didn't always agree on things, but Ellett he did a hell of a lot. In the last time I actively looked at the party in Georgia, you had Sue, and then you had after that the gentleman whose name I'm forgetting right now.
John Padgett.
Okay, well, clearly the party has been diminished by the importance of the governor's office, because when you have a governor, the party doesn't matter as much.
Like the Democrats
back in the old days. They didn't care who the party chairman was here in Georgia, because the governor was really the party chairman. Sort of the way it's been now. Padgett's time period was, to be kind, it was not something that I would consider to be active. They had a lot of money trouble. It just wasn't there. And so the party matters, but not as much. Party matters more when you're out of power. We used to fight over who. We talked earlier about Fred Cooper and the decision. The old decision where Mattingly was prevailed upon by Marguerite Williams to put Fred Cooper in as chairman, and that created a complete war back at the 1981 convention in DeKalb County. And I was there waiting for Mac, and he was late getting there. Every human being who could find me or Robert Atchison was trying to scream and yell at us about why this was so stupid. And I'm up there fighting with Mattingly, and Mattingly's fighting with Atchison, and we're all, it was a complete brouhaha because we didn't know what to do. In the end, Mattingly endorsed Fred, and primarily because of Matt Patton. And he just was not going to have Matt Patton.
And then 1989, you mentioned Alec Poitevin. Matt Patton was back with that sort of religious right.
Well, was that the Albany Convention, I believe?
88 was the Albany Convention. The Al Binney, when John Stuckey either threw or broke the gavel.
He broke it. It just broke off. John was a great guy, but he was a character. He just they got to him, and but those were important times for him. We fought more for the party than anything else. Now we don't fight that much about the party on the Republican side. The Democrats did, and it's funny because I served in the legislature with DuBose Porter, and DuBose can have a short fuse, and but he's a smart guy. He can get a little. He's a partisan, but this might be the year that DuBose pulls some. He hasn't been particularly effective in recent years, but he's had a stacked deck. But this might be the year in which he really shows some real success. And
what do you mean by being able to sort of join together compelling candidates, potential wave election? Well, we could ask your son if this is a wave election and how big is the wave.
I don't know. Let's put it this way. I look at two candidates. I see Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans. Now, I don't know either one of them very well. I know Abrams a bit. I don't know Evans. I think I've met her a few times. Both excellent candidates. The tradition in the Democratic Party in recent years is that the candidate supported by the Barnes axis wins the nomination. Mm-hmm. And if that were the case, then that means Stacey Evans would win the nomination. If she wins the nomination, she is a hellacious challenge to the Republicans because she is talking about the Hope Scholarship. She is talking about issues that I think people care about. She is a female. She is from an area that I used to represent. And so she is sort of that millennial type candidate. Now, one might say, why couldn't Jason Carter pull that off? Well, for a couple reasons. Jason was running against an incumbent. That's always harder. The second problem is Jason chose the wrong issues. I mean, Nathan Deal's big problem was that snowstorm that he handled.
Snowpocalypse.
It was the worst day possible, and had the Democrats ever taken advantage of it and brought in other failures and wrapped it around that, Jason could have had a chance of being much closer. But he decided to do what every other candidate does. There's one issue that never wins you an election in Georgia, and that's education, which is different from the Hope Scholarship. Saying you're going to improve education, people have heard it forever. Yeah,
Herman Talmadge.
It goes right through their education. It doesn't mean a damn thing. The Hope Scholarship does, because that's money in my pocket for my kids to go to school.
It's specific enough that you can actually grab a hold of.
It's giving me something, I don't have to pay for college for my kids. I mean, that's huge. Tell me you're going to improve education. Well, yeah. So Jason went education instead of making, and then at the last minute he went on the snow thing because he was just dying in the polls. But Jason was a good candidate. And I think had Jason run this year, he would have had a very good shot of winning.
In 2014, with the anti-Obama sentiment, with the midterm, second-term president.
Right. I mean, I think Jason was an excellent candidate, and I would not rule out the possibility that he'll be governor of Georgia someday, because he's got that Carter drive, and I like Jason.
A South Georgia turtle, as Ben Fortson.
Yes, exactly. So so. Wrapping up with this election that's coming up, well, let's say Abrams gets a nomination. Well, that's a tougher road because you have an African-American candidate running in a state that doesn't have a history of electing African-American statewide leaders at major positions, but it could happen. Mm-hmm. What she would have to do is drop the African-American diversification issue in the general election. She would have to become more moderate and more interested in how, whites in suburban areas are, and that's a hard shift to make when you're in that position.
Are you what's the phrase? Identity politics.
Yep.
Is that okay?
Exactly. But she could do it. I mean, anything can happen now. We now know that anything could happen. And I've noticed, interestingly, since I've come back to Georgia in the last few days, in reading that Abrams is being attacked in about contracts, this, that, and the other. The question is, it's really going to be interesting to see, can she survive the attacks from the traditional Democratic side, which is clearly probably where this is coming. And Evans overwhelm her with money and with support and with ads that tattoo her with this stuff. If she can survive that, then she might be a formidable candidate as well. But there are two different approaches. I think Evans has the better chance to beat a Republican this time.
Well, I think we pretty much touched on. We're not going to do like Mr. Clay and run out the battery.
No, and I'm ready to go whenever you are. Believe me.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for participating in the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much, Mr. Towery.
Thank you, and you can get your next history from me in St. Petersburg, Florida.
That's right. That's right.